Yeah. Hope my slide is visible. Good afternoon, all. This presentation is drawn from our ongoing research on narrative-led policy change, and it titled "Why Innovation Policy Narratives Matter and What Helps Them Change." We draw lessons from the Finnish circular economy transition, and a few more case studies are underway. Sustainability objectives have redefined innovation as a transformative process aimed at overhauling systems. This shift demands a new policy paradigm, which calls for different policy suites, processes, and measures for policy effectiveness. However, existing literature is ominously silent on how this policy shift will occur. Breaking policy path dependency requires understanding how narratives frame and sustain specific policy choices. A case study from Finland highlights the role of narratives in policy shift and conditions necessary for changing policy narratives for a sustainability focus. Narrative change is neither automatic nor quick. It requires proactive engagement in disrupting dominant narratives to create windows of opportunity for policy change. This process is both political and evidence-based. For our research, this means drawing on well-developed theories of narrative change from other fields and using innovation research as a boundary process to build support and legitimacy for new paradigms. SDGs imply breaking path dependencies and lock-ins in existing trajectories of innovation and redirecting trajectories towards new goals. This is not an incremental change, but a transformational agenda. Transformation means innovation in components, but it is also innovation in the system as a whole, so that innovation action is targeted at new values and objectives. This points to a paradigm shift. While there is no doubt that sustainability demands a completely different innovation policy paradigm, the disturbing question is, how do we actually shift to the new policy paradigm? How do we make it real? Sustainability scholars acknowledge that policies for a more sustainable society require narratives that sit outside the status quo. The relationship between narratives and policy is well understood, and there's a huge literature explaining how narratives lead to policy path dependency and shift. Narratives are critical because humans use them to convert human difficulties into policy problems and create coalitions of support or opposition among decision makers and the public. In contrast to innovation studies, there are several theories and frameworks on narratives and the role narratives play in changing policy paradigms. We use two such theories in our research. In identifying a theoretical frame that supports investigating narrative-led policy change, we combined Peter Hall's theory of policy paradigms with Deborah Stone's theory of causal narratives. The policy paradigm theory of Peter Hall says that incremental policy changes with low political stakes are very common. Then, occasionally, a major discontinuity occurs in the underlying assumptions and theories, leading to a shift to a new policy paradigm with high political stakes. Hall identified 4 necessary conditions for the paradigm shift that underlines the importance of coalition building and expert thinking as a rallying point for coalition building. Political windows of opportunity open when it becomes clear that policy options backed by existing theories are failing, and an alternative theory pops up backed by a vocal champion. Deborah Stone's typology of causal narratives give insights on narrative-led policy change. Narratives perform four important roles in this process, namely reality negotiation, policy structuring, uh, by narrating citizen-state relationships, and by building political strategy through identifying heroes, victims, culprits, saviors, and so on. From this, we draw three levels of system change through which a shift in policy may be achieved through narrative shift. This serves as a conceptual frame for our case study based on an extensive survey of academic and grey literature. These are the three levels of system change of narrative-led policy shift. We use the example of an ordinary factory setting for illustration. In the first level, that is problem definition and agenda setting, change agents strategically use narratives to transform situations into problems. Stone's typology of causal narratives explains how change agents shift public perceptions from the state of fate or accident to those amenable to human action. Here is an ordinary industrial situation which is shifted to a problem resulting from intentional human action and thus warranting policy intervention. Change agents achieve this through narrative action. The second level is coalition building and narrative structuring. From narrative structuring of their experience, policy actors and their coalition negotiate between narratives and counter-narratives. For example, economic growth versus carbon footprint. A narrative shifts then take place through iterative reflexive feedback loops. In the third level of framing and persuasion, change agents construct more popular narratives and employ strategies for influencing policy option and public opinions. This last process leads to a paradigm shift in practical terms. The Finnish circular economy transition took place at two levels. First, at international level within the European Council, and second in Finland. Finland was closely involved in the policy shift process in the European Council and leveraged international changes for national purposes. In this sense, the Finnish circular economy transition is a paradigm shift within a paradigm shift. Let's see how well this fits in our analytical frame. So here is our analytical frame. So in this case, the first two processes of the analytical frame, that is agenda setting and coalition building, took place internationally. That's at the European Council level. Finland was closely involved in this process, leveraging the Finnish vice presidency of the European Union at that point of time. The third process of policy framing and persuasion took place entirely within the Finnish national context. Thus, the Finnish policy paradigm shift is nested within an international policy paradigm shift. Hence, it is a paradigm shift within a paradigm shift. Next, let's look at the timeline of events and the policy shift in more detail. Finland is the largest waste producer in Europe. In 2009, they announced a national waste plan for 2016, an 8-year plan. In July 2014, the European Commission under Jose Barroso announced a new policy titled Towards a Circular Economy, a Zero Waste Program for Europe. So let's call it Zero Waste for convenience. Environmentalists welcomed this policy for its powerful regulatory framework, while the business community disliked it for the legally binding targets. In December 2014, the new presidency of European Council under Jean-Claude Juncker withdrew the zero waste policy. This led to massive opposition and media criticism. In response, Juncker Commission produced a new policy document titled Closing the Loop, an EU action plan for the circular economy. Hereafter, we call it Closing the Loop. Meanwhile, Finland had come to the vice presidency and played a major role in the shift. This was a paradigm shift from an incomplete to a complete CE, and leveraging this experience, Finland produced a circular economy roadmap in 2016 for implementation in Finland. Now, let's take a detailed look at the policy shift. The first paradigm is European Commission's zero waste policy, in which waste and resource scarcity were identified as problems. The agenda was to create a top-down regulatory framework to eliminate barriers to circular economy transition. The overarching narrative was circular economy as a solution for Europe's resource challenge. The second paradigm problematized the very agenda of the first, turning it upside down. That is, over-regulation is now a barrier. The revised agenda is to achieve full circularity through a bottom-up business action. A coalition was formed, including the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, a counter-narrative positioning circular economy as a business project with environmental benefits was introduced. A powerful symbol of a circular loop was employed to counter the incomplete half circle of the first paradigm. In the framing and persuasion process, Finland built a national level coalition, constructed a new set of popular narratives, and employed a persuasive access and maneuvering strategy. This essentially was a shift within shift. The question is, why the Finnish people had to be persuaded? The answer is this. The axing of the zero waste project led to massive opposition from environmentalists. Widespread media criticism shook the European Parliament. Anticipating resistance, the Finnish government resorted to a persuasive access and maneuvering strategy at home. At home, the Finnish government formed a coalition with Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund. The coalition modified the European Commission's narrative by constructing two popular narratives, economic advantage and global leadership for national prestige. Sitra framed C as an economic model. The global leadership and national prestige narrative promised that CE transition will regain Finland's diminishing legitimacy as a global environmental leader in the aftermath of an economic crisis. The coalition designed a set of 6 strategies for operationalizing these narratives. The access and maneuvering strategy involved a set of entry points and tactics. Strategic entry points aid in coalition building and serve as spaces for shaping public opinion. And further, the coalitions employed several tactics for maneuvering collective opinion to the desired direction. Having said this, I can sense a certain degree of skepticism among my audience about the validity of our claims over a paradigm shift. So let me lay all my cards on the table and go on to perform a check whether this case pass the Peter Hall policy paradigm shift. The question is whether this is a paradigm shift or not. Peter Hall defines a policy paradigm as a system of ideas and standards which is comprehensible and plausible to the actors involved. A policy paradigm shift is a wholesale shift for Peter Hall that simultaneously change the instrument settings, the instruments themselves, and the hierarchy of goals behind the policy. The conditions for a paradigm shift are One, occurrence of a serious anomaly in the existing policy. Two, political and theoretical support for a shift. Three, a coalition of experts generating an evidence, a very strong evidence base. So, did such a shift happen here in this case? In the circular economy literature, the shift from linear to circular economy is described as a paradigm shift that will move societal debates away from end of pipeline solutions. The case we presented is not a shift from a linear economy precisely, but from a half circular to a full circular economy policy. So in this sense, this is a partial paradigm shift. Nevertheless, the shift is from a top-down regulatory policy to a bottom-up non-regulatory business policy, which is no less paradigmatic. The opposition from within the European Parliament proves this is paradigmatic. A parliamentarian reportedly said that he needed a Valium to calm down. The top-down regulatory framework of zero-waste policy was critiqued as an anomaly. An alternative theory of circular economy as a business project with environmental benefits was available. There was a change in instrument settings, instruments themselves, and a hierarchy of goals. This was championed by the Juncker Commission and Finnish political leadership, aligning with the shifted political interests. A sufficient coalition legitimized this new theory, driving policy shift at European Commission and Finland. Hence, the case presented is a partial paradigm shift, if not full. Nevertheless, it gives insights into how narratives change for reframing policy. Let me conclude by stating the implications of our findings for innovation policy research. Sustainability goals have reimagined innovation as a process of systemic change, requiring a new policy paradigm focusing transformative innovation. However, current literature lacks guidance on how this shift will happen. While paradigm change is what we are interested in, the state of inertia or path dependency offers some lessons. Lessons as to how policy narratives persist even when their usefulness is questioned, and better alternatives are presented. Our research has been an attempt to understand how policy narratives can be modified, and in turn, how this modification process helps reframe policy options. Changing policy narratives, as seen in the Finnish case study, demands proactive disruption of dominant narratives with involvement of both political and evidence-based efforts, with coalitions and champions playing key roles. In this process, international changes can be leveraged for national purposes. Thank you.
Fabulous, Rajesh. That was a really cool presentation and very, very interesting case. I'm going to open up for questions, but I've got some myself, so people better put their hands up if they don't want to hear me wax on. I'm sure you've got some people. Thank you for those who put their cameras back on. I much appreciate. I'm going to ask one then. So there's a thing here about directionality, Rajesh, that a paradigm shift doesn't necessarily imply a sustainable direction, and can actually be industry capture potentially of the policy paradigm. Although I'm not suggesting that's necessarily the case in this situation, there is a move from a regulatory, governmental, therefore public good initiative to one that is industry-led and unregulated. So how do you square that idea of the policy paradigm shift versus the directionality to achieve substantive societal goals?
Yeah, perfect, Pete. You have go to the core of this argument. Now, I have to say that it is very difficult to find cases of policy shift mediated by narrative shift is very difficult. Now we could pick up a few cases, and some other case studies are progressing. In this particular case, there is an evidence that narrative shift has led to a paradigm shift. But as you said, whether the direction of that paradigm shift was favorable to sustainability or not is a question. The answer is it was not. It was falling back to the industry growth and productivity driving purposes. So for a case study, our interest was to find a case study that demonstrates policy shift through power of narratives. So that was the idea behind the case study. As you said, the direction is still in question. We still have to find a case that combines both directionality and narrative-led policy shift.
Or perhaps to be a case of that, Rajesh, seeing as we're doing action research in this world. Rebecca.
Thanks. I can talk to Rajesh about this anytime, so please maybe go to Rose first and then I'll come in after.
She can talk to him too. You go.
Okay.
So we've got time.
Rajesh, I like your Peter Hall test. Thanks. I'm interested in, similar to Pete, your question of industry capture of the policy narrative. So kind of a similar question. What about when you have this narrative, like a just energy transition, but it's being used by the industry to perpetuate a certain objective and the just gets left behind? What's the test for narrative actually leading to paradigm change or a narrative being captured by the industry without change?
Does that need a test? It is obvious, when things happen. So I had to do this test just to convince. But you triggered that question and test, Rebecca, because when you read that paper draft, you asked this question: is this a clear paradigm shift? And that was a real good question, and that led me spend some time to test it and find a way to test it. So this has to be tested for the rigor of the paper. Otherwise, capturing shifts is always the case, and that is the complexity of policy making and policy changes. All policy changes need not be well directed. It's a tough battleground.
We'll keep talking.
Sure.
I think it's a really interesting question for us all, Beck, because I would argue that the literature suggests that the legitimacy of the narrative is sustained by its trueness to the direction. So if we say we're doing something and we're not doing it, then pretty soon that idea becomes illegitimate, whether it's justice or sustainability or biodiversity positive or whatever. But anyway, it's a fascinating question. Rose, to you.
Thank you. And, don't know much about this space really, Rajesh. I'm interested, Finland as a case study, it's a very, very tiny population. It's very homogenous. And it has very, very particular kind of cultural structures. How do you think that translates to Australia, which is arguably one of the most diverse? It's much, much bigger, but it's also very, very diverse in comparison. So that's what I'm really interested in about, like the translation to a quite a different cultural and political system.
Thanks, Rose. That's a really nice question, and this is a question that we have been engaging with over the past 18 months. We have just completed an international case study of 10 countries and submitted a report to the APD for generating options for finding an answer to the question that you just raised. But for this case study, we had to look at a less complex country where that permits us to to take a very clear, uncomplicated look to understand the mechanisms that is working behind this policy shift. That's why we selected 3 countries, 3 small countries with small population and less complicated policy processes and political systems, and also favored, as you rightly mentioned, with a set of ideal cultural backdrops of trust, cooperation, and political continuity, policy continuity across political cycles and electoral cycles. So these were certain, certain things that minimize complexity when we look at the study from a student point of view, just to understand what's the mechanism behind it. We took Finland, Sweden, and Netherlands as case studies, and we have very good illustrations of how narrative-led policy shift happen here. Your question is very valid. So why we do this? We do this to find answers and find ways of, shifting predominant, ruling and hard to change policies in our policy context, and imparts a sense of directionality to the innovation policy, an innovation policy which might be under the making. So that's
Thank you, Rajesh. I'm going to have to close this there. It's also worth pointing out, Rose, that we've done a few Australian cases as well in a different context associated with the project, and but yeah, it's a work in progress, and we are in an active case with APD and DEF and ABARES and a bunch of other people to actually try and shift the policy narrative in a collaborative way. So I'll leave that at that. Thank you so much to both our speakers. Big round of applause. Fantastic talks. I'm aware we're